This is the Listening Tube.
Hello, thank you for putting your ear to the Listening Tube. I'm your host, Bob Woodley. On this episode, we'll hear about May Day, oppressed versus oppressor, and the trickle that led to a flood of freedom. I'll also talk to a man about our innate desire to cut down the successful among us. But first,
Not the headlines.
a recent Reuters story about how the demand for donkey hides in China is depleting Africa of an important part of its transportation system and workforce really burned my ass. For thousands of years, donkeys have been helping mankind progress with its strength and endurance. Still today, many people in rural Africa rely on donkeys to do what they've always done. They haul goods and people, providing a return on investment for those who manage them well, but still affordable for those who just need them to do everyday tasks. But their hard work is only one of the things that makes donkeys not just a valuable resource, but a commodity. The other is their hide. Unfortunately, the hide is more valuable than the labor the donkey provides. Why? Because of a product derived from the hide that's popular in China. The problem is, donkeys can't reproduce fast enough to keep up with the demand for the hides. One pig can create 50 offspring to every one donkey foal. So now, Chinese companies are buying up as many donkey hides as they can from African traders. Where these traders are getting the donkeys is a whole other problem, with many being stolen or taken by force in other ways. It might be similar to getting your car stolen, but there's no donkey insurance and you can't just go get another donkey because they're getting harder to find. The product so coveted in China that comes from the donkey hide is called yijiao. It's been made there for 3,000 years and is considered a national cultural heritage, as cited by the Chinese state media. Yijiao is believed to enrich your blood, prevent diseases, and improve your immune system. They make all kinds of products out of it, different kinds of food additives that you can use at home, plus pre-made products. It's also an ingredient in beauty products. It's basically a type of collagen, and was for most of its existence reserved for those who could afford luxury products. Popular during the Qing dynasty, its popularity waned in the early 1900s, but then it was featured on a Chinese television drama beginning in 2011, and all of a sudden, the same class of people who couldn't afford it 100 years ago are now seeing it on big screen televisions. Since the show came on, the price for the donkey hide product has gone up leaps and bounds. What once cost 100 won now costs almost 3,000. Still, the demand is so high that nearly 6 million donkey hides are needed per year to satisfy the need. China only has about 2 million donkeys on hand. Africa has more donkeys left than anybody, but maybe not for long. Certain areas of Africa have enacted laws to stifle the trade, both legal and illegal, in donkeys, but the patchwork of laws and regulations only means the traders have to plan their routes to the buyers more carefully. The good news for the donkeys is that the African Union banned the slaughter of donkeys for their skin across the continent. But that may only change where the slaughter is done. The only solution to the problem is to educate the people of China about the result of their demand for the product. There's also the prospect of creating the same substance using other methods. There will always be a demand for the product, and the illegal trade in donkey skins is inevitable, but perhaps the Chinese Communist Party can help their citizens reduce their demand and give donkeys the time they need to live a life before becoming a food additive. It's ironic that a country that was still riding bicycles as the major form of transportation just 50 years ago and is now a maker of electric cars and spacecraft, is now depleting the world's supply of donkeys and taking away a mode of transportation from the people who need them the most.
Well, that can't be right.
Speaking of transportation and electric cars, a story from Inside Radio says droves of automakers are backing away from electric vehicle production. They list Ford and GM, as well as European companies, as those who are changing course. But nobody's making any U-turns. While all of them still have plans to implement electrification to their lineups in different ways and at different levels, the sales of all electric plug-in vehicles isn't keeping up with manufacturers' expectations, despite tax breaks and mandates meant to stimulate sales and popularity. The early adopters have all jumped on board, and the rest haven't been enticed enough, or perhaps convinced enough. Although sales and interest have waned overall, there is still steady progress being made after the initial boom. But it seems the buying public is leaning more toward a gradual transition than an abrupt one. Hybrid cars have become the focus of automakers in the West, giving the public what we want, which seems to be more options when it comes to how we power our vehicles. We don't seem to want to be locked into just one now that we know we can have both. When the Polaroid land camera first came out, you could only take black and white pictures with it. After everybody bought one, they came out with an instant camera that could take color pictures. Then everybody had to buy another one. That's what the government is trying to make us do with our cars. But unlike the Polaroid company, the auto industry figured out how to make the car in black and white and color. Meanwhile, in Japan, two giant automakers, Nissan and Honda, recently announced that they'll begin working together on electric vehicles and auto intelligence technology. East and West in both direction and philosophy. Even though Honda has always been a leader in innovation, and Nissan came out with one of the first modern EVs in the Leaf in 2010, an AP story by Yuri Kageyama claims Japanese automakers are lagging behind Tesla in the United States and China's BYD in electric car technology. Facing a common challenge, these two former rivals, Honda and Nissan, believe they can work together toward shareable discoveries while still maintaining its respective identity. They won't be buying any property or building any factories together, at least for now. The details are still being worked out, but both companies agree that time is of the essence. Honda's president says the companies share common values and could create synergies to help them compete with much larger rivals in China and in Japan. Toyota is the world's largest automaker. Like automakers in the US and Europe, Toyota is focused on hybrid vehicles instead of the full electric ones made by Tesla and China. We'll see how it all plays out. The U.S. government mandates are still in play. Inflation and price points are an issue right now, as well as interest rates for many. There's clearly a lot of confusion in the auto industry right now. They don't know what to make because they don't yet have a handle on what it is we want or what governments will force on us. In the meantime, there's a Mexican standoff among gas, electric, and hybrid cars going on, and China's planning on building an electric car factory in Mexico itself. Maybe they'll need donkeys to work there. By the way, sales of Teslas in the first quarter of the year are down 55% from the first quarter last year.
Let's go back through the listening tube for This Week in History.
This week in 1889, May 1st is designated Workers' Day by an international federation of socialist groups and trade unions. They chose May 1st as a way to commemorate the Haymarket riot in Chicago 3 years earlier. Britannica.com says leaders in the Soviet Union embraced the new holiday, hoping it would unite workers in the United States and Europe against capitalism. In 1894, U.S. President Grover Cleveland proclaimed the first Monday in September as Labor Day in the United States so as to separate it from the Socialist Workers' Day on May 1st. Canada followed suit. In 1906, 6,000 German workers were fired after a May Day strike. But then in 1933, Germany, influenced by the Nazi Party, recognized May Day as an official holiday. It was a short-lived celebration, though. The following day, the same German government abolished free unions, destroying the German labor movement.
The 1900s.
This week in 1929, the Rye Cove tornado outbreak swept across the United States. Beginning with an F2 in Oklahoma, over the next 30-plus hours, tornadoes would cause damage and death through Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, Ohio, Florida, West Virginia, and Maryland. Among the 42 fatalities were 13 from one schoolhouse in Rye Cove, Virginia. It is still today the deadliest tornado in Virginia history. There is no official estimate on the cost of the damage done as the tornadoes spawned across the country, nor is there an accurate count of how many tornadoes there were. But there was a song written about the Rye Cove outbreak by the Carter family.
Oh, listen today in a story I tell, in sadness and tear dimmed eyes, of a dreadful cyclone that came this way and blew our schoolhouse away. Rye Cove, Rye Cove, Rye Cove, Rye Cove, the place of my childhood and home, where in life 30 more and I once loved to roam, but now it's so silent and lone.
Climate change, said no one. This week in 1945, the Dachau concentration camp is liberated by United States troops. There's a lot of talk today about genocide. People are accusing Israel of it for the way they're conducting their war against Hamas. Those who do so have no idea about what genocide is. Before you accuse anyone of genocide, take a look at what happened at places like Dachau and Auschwitz. Aside from the fact that many Palestinians live in Israel, there is no comparison to genocide and what Israel is trying to accomplish by eliminating the Hamas militant group. Those who claim Israel is committing genocide are not only misinformed, but are also spreading misinformation. If they know what they're saying isn't true, they're also liars who are trying to manipulate a situation to suit their needs. Also this week in 1945, during World War II, Adolf Hitler marries his longtime partner Eva Braun in a Berlin bunker, the Führer bunker, and designates Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor. Both Hitler and Braun will commit suicide the next day. I once reported from the place. On the 40th anniversary of Hitler's suicide, I was a reporter for AFN Berlin. My videographer and I went to a platform overlooking the Berlin Wall onto the area where Hitler's bunker once stood. It was an historical piece, so I had the script written on cue cards. When we got there, freezing rain was falling from the sky. It was cold enough that my cheeks froze to the point where I couldn't form some of my words correctly, and the ink on my cue cards was running. It was a miserable experience, and I blamed Hitler. I couldn't even imagine what it was like just 40 years ago. The city was in ruins, soldiers everywhere, famine and disorder, much like Gaza is today. And it all started with the Jews as the catalyst, even though the Jews had done nothing wrong. Sound familiar? When the forces that tried to exterminate the Jews were defeated, we hailed them as heroes. Why is it different now? Perspective. Back in 1945, the Jewish people were the oppressed. They were targeted for who they were and nothing else. Today, Israel and the Jewish people are seen by many as the oppressors. They're not, nor are they committing genocide. But because the left has labeled Israel as oppressors, even after the brutal attack by Hamas, young people on college campuses are rallying for the people who did the attacking. While they condemn Israel and the United States as fascist, they reprise the role of the Nazi Party of the 1930s and 40s. I understand the general support of the non-Jewish people of the region. I don't understand the support for Hamas. And I've seen support for Hamas on American television. What I haven't seen is much being done about it. Support for Hamas is trying to hide behind the First Amendment right to free speech, but the threatening language of more attacks like the one that started the war isn't protected speech. Unfortunately, the Biden administration isn't willing to risk losing left-wing voters by prosecuting those who are clearly advocating violence and endorsing past violence. This week in 1989, Hungary begins dismantling its border fence with Austria, which allows a number of East Germans to defect. That small gesture would eventually lead to the fall of the Soviet Empire. The Cold War would come to an end. The countries of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would suddenly find themselves with a fleeting chance for independence. Decisions had to be made. Boundaries had to be set. For nearly a dozen years, it seemed like there would be peace between the two biggest powers in the world, the United States and the countries that emerged from the former Soviet Union. The problem was the battles of power that were being waged between the regions. There were many who wanted to keep the socialist system. A new millennia brought us the tyrant leader of the former Soviet state of Russia, who is trying to tie the old order back together again. He chose Ukraine for a lot of good reasons to be the first to absorb, but they're still putting up a fight. Belarus is under Putin's thumb, but Ukraine won't go so easily. Bolstered by a new package of arms shipments from the United States, they'll be able to launch a more offensive posture. Plus, we just found out that the U.S. sent longer-range weaponry without even telling Congress. I'm still waiting for the West to provide more air power.
The listening tube will return at the speed of sound. Contact the listening tube by calling 570-601-1101 or email thelisteningtube@outlook.com.
O.J. Simpson, the Hall of Fame running back and pitchman, known as much for running through airports as on the gridiron, became a classic story about how the mighty can fall. Many of us took delight in his downfall. Most of us were at least intrigued by it. My guest this week knows all about the emotions that we experience while watching our heroes falter. It's called tall poppy syndrome. Dr. Douglas Garland is a former professor of orthopedic surgery at USC and has traced the tall poppy syndrome all the way back to the dawn of time, to find out why we find satisfaction in the failure of others. You've written a book about something called the tall poppy syndrome. Can you briefly describe what it is and what inspired you to write about it?
The tall poppy syndrome is a metaphor for looking at a field of poppies and see one or a few that are taller than the rest and wanting to cut that poppy down so that all are the same.
So, who's doing the cutting?
Well, you are. You've probably cut people down. Everybody's probably cut people down. It's like sinning. There aren't anybody that hasn't sinned. So the whole problem with the tall poppy syndrome is our culture has been very individualist and we've worshiped the individual in the past. That's significantly changed over the last 50 years. The tall poppy syndrome was originally described by the Greeks and Romans 2,500 years ago. And when I did research on it, it was, I could identify it in every country, every time period, but not America. So that became my journey. I took the New York Times, LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, various outlets, and I looked for tall poppy syndrome every day in the papers and in the media. And lo and behold, it was easy for me to observe the tall poppy syndrome. In fact, once I completed all my research, I felt the tall poppy syndrome was more prevalent in America than it was in any other country. And that's because of our hierarchy and because of our meritocracy. And we're always climbing the ladder of success. And most commonly, it's easier to cut people down than it is to improve yourself.
Well, now, you say that everyone's guilty of it. Now, my wife has poppies growing in the front yard every year, and one year somebody just lopped off the tops of them as they went by. The poppies had done nothing except stand there and look nice. I've never had the urge to do that to somebody else's poppies. Are we talking about the same kind of people here?
Yes, we are. That's an example of the tall poppy syndrome. That somebody, that's an example of bad envy, which I'll go into shortly. But for whatever reason, they didn't like the poppies, were envious of your wife's poppy field. And so to so-called get even with her, they cut those poppies down. And I have to tell you, that's a subtle example. But so the way I look at the tall poppy syndrome is it's emotional behavior. And emotional behavior, the emotions, I divide them into good and bad. Other psychologists define them differently, but I just find the good and bad way to look at an emotion the easiest. So envy, I consider the most common emotion, especially on the internet, available because we're always comparing ourselves to somebody else. So the first thing you have to understand, good envy would be somebody seeing your wife's poppy field and thinking it's wonderful and wanting to emulate that. So the next thing you walk down the street, you see another poppy field in your neighbor's yard. So that's an example of good envy. They felt that she improved the looks of your home and they wanted to do the same thing. So that's good envy, is looking at a tall poppy and wanting to emulate that person. That's how I got into medical school. I grew up in a small farm town of 400 people in central Iowa. I had very little background in academics. And in high school, I started studying people smarter than me. In college, I did that. And when I was in medical school, I roomed with two guys in the top five. So I was emulating tall poppies, but I didn't understand what I was doing at that time. Bad envy is cutting the person down so that improves their own sense of self-worth. So that's what they were doing to your wife's flower bed. They felt better because they probably didn't have such a nice flower bed at their own home. Number one cause of the tall poppy syndrome in the cutter is bad envy, that you don't feel as good about yourself because of what somebody else has that you don't. That's the definition of envy. So if you can't self-improve yourself to obtain that, then the easiest way out is to cut somebody down.
So, who's the real victim of tall poppy syndrome? Is it the person who feels the need to cut others down, or is it the target of the attack?
It's both. So that's how I reframed or redefined the tall poppy syndrome. So you have to look at the cutter and you have to look at the tall poppy. But the seven deadly sins are envy, anger, and laziness. And those three emotions are commonly found in the cutter. For whatever reason, that those are the most common emotions. Lazy is just people that don't, probably the person that cut your wife's flower poppies down just were too lazy to grow them themselves, because poppies are weeds. You can just throw the seeds out and they'll grow. Tall poppy themselves, due to what I call egregious behavior and justification by the poppy to feel the tall poppy deserves to be cut down, is pride, greed, and lust. So I've just named six of the seven deadly sins. The only one I didn't mention was gluttony. That's not usually part of the syndrome. So that when you look at the tall poppy syndrome, your tall poppy is not my tall poppy. So nobody, well, Trump is a good example of that. So he has all the common emotional traits that are frequently found in tall poppies, and then the public justifies in cutting them down. So it can be both, and that's the real matter of my book, was to try and explain it. The book is really a self-help book, because if you understand the tall poppy syndrome, you'll understand societal behavior, neighborhood behavior, country behavior, international behavior. And through understanding that, you also improve yourself. So by understanding the tall poppy syndrome, you understand human behavior, and that helps you self-reflect and become more self-aware and improve yourself.
Now, you've compared the tall poppy syndrome to the German phrase Schadenfreude, which I'm a bit familiar with, having lived in Berlin. And Schadenfreude means to get joy out of others' misery. What's the difference between those who enjoy other people's failure and those who cause other people's failure?
Schadenfreude is driven by bad envy. And just somebody got joy out of cutting down your wife's poppies. That's why they did it. And Schadenfreude actually is the end stage of the tall poppy syndrome. Our whole Hollywood industry is driven by the tall poppy syndrome and Schadenfreude. If you go to the movies and you watch I actually have a blog on It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. At Christmas time, he was cut down by Mr. Potter. So in the end, Mr. Potter was cutting Jimmy Stewart down, but in the end, because of Potter's egregious behavior, his ruthlessness, and his greed, the town eventually cut Mr. Potter down. That's what happens at the very end of the story. And what did people feel when Potter got cut down? Schadenfreude.
Very little difference between those who enjoy other people's failures and those who cause other people's failures.
Yes. So let me explain how the tall poppy syndrome happens in America. Most tall poppy syndrome happens within your tribe, and it's not a tall poppy. So once you understand the public tall poppy syndrome, and the emotions evolve, the envy, the anger, and then the egregious behavior of the tall poppy, which is pride, lust, and greed. You can translate that into everything else. The tall poppy syndrome occurs mostly with people who aren't tall poppies. So, first of all, the tall poppy syndrome is very prevalent in your own family. So, within the family, there can become familial envy, which is very, very common. One sibling tries to be better than the other. And if they are doing that, the others try and cut them down. All we have to do is look at in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, like chapter 3, I think it is, Cain and Abel. You see the first example of the tall poppy syndrome ends up in murder by his brother. So it happens in your family. It's very subtle unless you understand the tall poppy syndrome. You don't understand family behavior. Then it starts in the school. You do the same thing. The competition of school to get A's, to be better than somebody else, that persists into college, and that same thing persists into the workforce. So you're always crawling up the ladder of success. And if you're not doing a good job and somebody else is doing a better job, it's easier to cut them down to get the promotion. And so the neighborhood, somebody has a better yard than you do, you either cut the poppies down or you grow your own poppies. So the tall poppy syndrome is actually more prevalent within your tribe than it is the public, where you see somebody like Trump and want to cut them down.
Does the person who causes the fall of another then become next in line to be cut down, or do they have some sort of legend status or immunity?
Well, the if you so the you could think of the tall poppy in the private setting as being a bully. So he's going to bully his way to get to the top. But usually a bully is not a tall poppy. His behavior is wrong. It's usually driven by bad envy, and he's cutting other people down to improve himself. So eventually, the Peter principle will take effect, and then he'll reach his height of his
Ability?
own madness and be cut down by the the company or the other group of people. So it's a dead end unless you do the right behavior.
Is the goal of the tall poppy syndrome in a collective sense equity?
Yes. Equity is a big cutter. That's actually my next blog. I'm almost done with this week's blog, but my next week is actually going to be on equity as the cutter in the tall poppy syndrome. They're using this zero sum game at the expense of tall poppies. So, Whitey has a difficult time now. The Asians have a difficult time now. The Jews have a difficult time now, all through the so-called eyes of equity. And they're using that to cut people down. But as far as I'm concerned, that is a supreme example of the tall poppy syndrome, hidden under justification or virtue signaling. We got a lot of fake people out there now who hide behind virtue signaling, and that's their justification to cut people down. Good people, successful people, but they want that success and they don't want the hard way. They want the easy way.
So, does giving this behavior a clinical name somehow justify it? I mean, is there going to come a time when I can just tell the judge that I had to break his leg because he was having too much success?
Well, isn't that the race card right now? And whenever all else fails, just call them a racist. I also wrote a blog on the culture of fear, and that's what's happening in the campuses right now is the culture of fear. That we have a small percent of the population controlling campuses in America, and the rest of the people are afraid to stand up because of fear that they'll be cut down, they'll be called a racist or whatever they're going to be called, but they can't stand up for themselves. So, in answer to your question, it's yes. But all that is bad behavior. And that bad behavior, for the most part, is driven by envy.
So tell me a little bit
And
more then.
here's another important thing for listeners. Envy and jealousy are used interchangeably in the English language, especially in America. And jealousy is not envy, and envy is not jealousy. Envy is coveting what someone else has. And you either want that or you actually want to destroy their happiness. So in your wife's case, that was they were trying to destroy her happiness. Jealous, so somebody has something you don't have. And unfortunately in America, we've become the oppressed and the oppressor, and the oppressor, everybody, the oppressed now think it's the oppressor's fault, and they want to cut them down when they need to self-reflect and look at their own selves and figure out why they're not successful. So jealousy is actually losing something that you already have. But there's a complete difference, and people don't understand what envy really is and why it's such a bad emotion and why it's plaguing America right now.
Is there a way to rid our society, our psyches, of the tall poppy syndrome?
I published over 120 peer-reviewed scientific articles. So when I said about understanding the tall poppy syndrome, the first thing you have to, in a disease, the first thing we have to do is identify the disease or name it so that we can treat it. I've given you various emotions involved in that syndrome. You have to pick the emotion that's involved in each particular instance of the tall poppy syndrome. And so if it's pride, then how do we treat pride? It's with humility. So it's like cancer. There's not one cure. It's to understand the syndrome. A syndrome is a complex. So there's a lot of different emotions involved in the tall poppy syndrome. In order to understand it, you have to have emotional intelligence. You have to understand the emotions, and the cure is the opposite emotion. So once again, pride is going to be humility. Greed is going to be giving back. Lust obviously will be abstinence. So the cure will depend on the underlying emotion in one particular situation over the other.
Now, is there a name for people like myself who find joy in the success of others and sadness in the fall of people who became successful?
Fruit and joy is enjoying the joy of somebody else, and that actually is the cure for the tall poppy syndrome. We good envy involves emulating and enjoying other people's success, our past bad behavior in a bad lens. And so we don't want competition anymore. We want equity. We don't want valedictorians. We want everybody getting the diploma. And I don't think like that. And I don't think we didn't become America with thinking like that.
Dr. Garland, what effect does tall poppy syndrome have on individualism?
If you understand the tall poppy syndrome and the emotions and the difference between good and bad emotions, it brings you to self-improvement of yourself. And to self-improve yourself makes you a better person, which makes you a better individual. And there's a right amount of collectivism and a right amount of individualism. That's what's ruining America. We need that individual in the collective to bring the collective up. That's why we became frontier community to the greatest builder of middle class in the world. That was all because of tall poppies. That was all because of Standard Oil, General Electric, all the robber barons who now are bad people, but they elevated the entire middle class of America and made us the greatest country in the world, all due to tall poppies, not due to collectivism.
I think you could throw Henry Ford in that group
He
as
was in
well.
that group. He's part of the group.
You can learn more about Dr. Garland at douggarland.com. Also, tallpoppysyndrome.org. Envy and low self-esteem lead to tall poppy syndrome. Equity is the goal. Those who practice tall poppy syndrome need help, and those who are victims of it simply because of their success are worthy of the benefit of the doubt when targeted because of their success. Those who are successful today are often confused with oppressors and are therefore subject to venomous attacks from the left. Sure, it's easier to criticize those who are successful than it is to do the work to be successful. But none of us gains anything from cutting down those of us who succeed.
Now it cuts like a knife. Yeah, but it feels so right. Oh, it cuts like a knife. Yeah, but it feels so right. Oh, it cuts like a knife. But it feels so right, baby. Oh, it cuts like a knife.
The Listening Tube is written and produced by yours truly. Copyright 2024. Thank you for putting your ear to the Listening Tube. Subscribe today. I'm your host, Bob Woodley, for Thou Ad Infinitum.